2000, Zimbabwe expropriated land from white commercial farmers without compensation and distributed the land to a landless black people and the connected elite who now owns multiple farms. The country budgeted the money in its current budget, and the offer has now been accepted by a union representing them.
Well, to tell us a little bit more about this story, we now welcome from our Pretoria studios Zimbabwe's ambassador to South Africa, His Excellency David Hamadziripi. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Ambassador. So things have changed quite a lot. I mean, I don't think this would have been expected by many people, particularly when we consider how the land was taken during the Mugabe administration. Why has government decided to compensate these white farmers?
Good afternoon. The decision by the government to compensate the former farm owners for farm improvements is based on, first, the Constitution of Zimbabwe itself does provide for compensation for farm improvements to the former farm owners. Secondly, this principle of compensation was never disavowed even in the process of land reform in Zimbabwe. You may want to go all the way back to 1979 at the Lancaster House Conference. The principle of compensation was already accepted, and that is why you find in that agreement there was, in fact, an understanding and an agreement that the British government, together with other governments, were going to contribute towards the acquisition and resettlement of land.
All right, so then perhaps the question might be then, why only now, if the provisions for this have been there as far back as 1977?
Well, you may recall that in 1997, when you had a Labour Party government led by Mr. Tony Blair taking over in the United Kingdom, that's when you had the United Kingdom government reneging on the Lancaster House agreements. And I think it will take us quite a long time to talk about that history. So the program was disrupted because of that decision that was taken in 1997. But the current government has taken the decision and has, in fact, made the commitment that it wants to finalize all these compensation issues to do with the farmers. And as I indicated earlier, in the 2013 Constitution, there is provision for compensation compensation to the farmers who are affected by the land reform program. And you do have categories in terms of the levels of compensation. So for those farms that are under the bilateral investment protection and promotion agreements, there is compensation both for land and for any improvements that took place on that land. But for other farmers, and this you will find in the Constitution, the compensation is just for farm improvements. In the category of farmers we are talking about in this instance is going to be compensation for farm improvements and not for the land.
So the white farming community, I would imagine that you've had negotiations with them, and are they happy with this movement in terms of getting compensation and the amounts involved?
Yes, in fact, what you have is a joint exercise that is underway, that is involving both the government and the former farm owners who are represented by the Commercial Farmers Union. And in those discussions, you are looking at what we are calling the computation and establishing the compensation quantum figure for farm improvements. And in fact, there is quite some significant progress that has been made in that exercise, to the point that we are anticipating that the comprehensive farm improvements valuation exercise should be completed by the end of this month, and that there should be hopefully an agreement on the compensation quantum figure for farm improvements by the end of next month. What you have presently is what we are calling an interim advance payment, which will be made to these former farm owners, and particularly those who are in financial distress. And the process to identify and register the former farm owners who want to participate in the interim advance payments is actually being carried out, coordinated by the Commercial Farmers Union and the Compensation Steering Committee, which is representing the former farm owners. And that process has already commenced, and we are hoping that the registration of the registration and the list of these farmers should be completed by the end of this month.
All right. Ambassador, do we know how much is required to do this interim payment, and then maybe even the total compensation? I guess that's still being calculated, but what sort of figures are we looking at this stage?
At this stage, in the current budget, you have an amount of 53 million RTGS dollars, which is our local currency. And this, as I indicated, is really an interim advance payment. And it is also intended to convey government's commitment to compensate these former farm owners. Presently, the exercise is still underway, as I indicated earlier, to determine the final figures in terms of the quantum of compensation that will be due to the farmers. And this we are hoping that can be completed by end of May. One of the things that you may want to recall, and again stemming from the Lancaster House discussions, there was an acceptance and acknowledgement that the government of Zimbabwe on its own would not be able to meet the requirements for the land reform. And even in this case, the government will not be able to meet all the requirements for purposes of compensating for land improvements or even for the land itself to those who are due the compensation. So there are already going to be discussions with international financial institutions and with other stakeholders in order to find a way of sustainably making these compensation payments.
All right. Ambassador Hamadziripi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for sharing your thoughts and insights on this development. Thank you so much indeed for your time, sir.